When you sign a legal contract, like for a new job or maybe a mortgage, you read the whole thing, right? Or, well, at least you pretend to,
Yeah, you skim it at the very least.
right? But you understand intuitively that, paragraph 4 only really makes sense because of paragraph 3.
Absolutely. The surrounding text is what actually gives that single sentence its boundaries.
Exactly.
Mm.
Because if someone just highlighted, I don't know, one single sentence on page 42 and said, look, it says you owe me $1 million, you'd immediately say, wait, what's the context?
You'd have to. Without the broader document, those words are just raw material. I mean, you can manipulate them into meaning almost anything you want.
And yet, when it comes to reading ancient texts, especially sacred texts, we often just throw that basic logic right out the window.
We really do.
So welcome to today's deep dive. We have a genuinely fascinating mission for you today. We are exploring a stack of research centered on a document called Word of Faith Critique.
It's a really interesting piece of work.
It is. It's an in-depth look at biblical hermeneutics, which is basically just a scholarly word for interpretation.
Right.
And specifically, we're looking at how mainstream historical and evangelical scholars analyze the teachings of the Word of Faith movement.
Yeah, and it serves as a brilliant exercise in critical thinking. But to be completely clear with you listening right now, our goal today is absolutely not to take theological or political sides.
Yeah, no.
We are purely unpacking what mainstream scholars have observed about how these specific interpretations work mechanically. So it's not just an exploration of what people believe, but the mechanics of how they arrive at those beliefs based on the way they read ancient documents.
Right. We were just looking at the blueprints today.
Yeah.
And the golden rule of our deep dive, which is actually a famous maximum among the scholars in our source document, is this. A text without a context is a pretext for a proof text.
That warning really anchors the entire critique, because before we look at the specific claims of the Word of Faith movement, we first have to examine the primary tool that critics say is driving those claims.
Which is proof texting.
Exactly, proof text.
Okay, let's unpack this right away because, quoting a sentence from a book doesn't sound inherently dangerous. We quote Shakespeare and Churchill all the time.
Sure.
So what exactly makes proof texting a problem in the eyes of these scholars?
Well, it fundamentally comes down to the mechanics of how we approach reading. Mainstream biblical scholars, people like D.A. Carson, Gordon Fee, and N.T. Wright, they point to the difference between two vital concepts in literary analysis:
Okay, what are they?
exegesis and eisegesis. So exegesis means drawing the meaning out of the text. You look at the grammar, the historical background, the surrounding paragraphs.
And you let the author's original intent sort of surface.
Exactly.
It's kind of like being an archaeologist, right? You're digging in the dirt to find the artifact that's already there, regardless of whether you actually like what you find.
That's a really helpful way to visualize it. But eisegesis is the exact opposite. It means reading your own preconceived ideas into the text.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so you already have a conclusion in mind, and you just scour the book to find a sentence that, if you isolate it, seems to support your point.
And that is what scholars mean by proof texting.
Right. You strip a verse of its history and its surrounding narrative and use it as standalone proof for a doctrine.
So proof texting is basically like writing a review for a movie when you've only watched a 10-second out-of-context clip on social media.
That's a great analogy.
Because you can make that clip mean whatever you want since you've completely ignored the plot. You could take a clip of the villain laughing, ignore the context of the murder he just committed, and review the movie as a heartwarming comedy.
Exactly. You're reacting to the raw data of the clip while completely missing the intent of the director. And this brings us to how critics apply this concept to Word of Faith theology.
Right.
Theologians argue that the distinct doctrines of this movement, concepts like the force of faith, positive confession, and guaranteed physical prosperity, they rely heavily on this practice of isolating verses from their original narrative flow.
Okay, let's dive into those specific concepts then. The Word of Faith movement has some incredibly popular ideas. I want to start with this idea of faith as a literal substance.
Sure.
If I'm reading the English translation of Hebrews 11:1, it says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for."
Right. Substance.
Yeah, and I have to admit, reading the word substance makes it sound like physical putty or like building blocks. How do scholars justify saying it isn't?
It's a great question, and it's where linguistic history becomes so important. So, in Word of Faith theology, faith is often viewed as an ontological reality,
Meaning what exactly?
meaning it's a literal, tangible, metaphysical force. Proponents argue it's a spiritual material you can utilize to frame reality.
Wow. Okay.
But Greek scholars point out that the word translated into English as substance is actually the Greek word hypostasis.
Hypostasis. And what did hypostasis mean to a person living in the first century?
Well, in that specific historical and linguistic context, it did not mean a physical or metaphysical material that you could wield. It meant assurance or guarantee or confidence.
Oh, wow. So it's a psychological or relational state, not a spiritual raw material.
Exactly. And when you look at the broader context of the book of Hebrews, that definition really locks into place.
That's so.
The author is writing to an audience facing intense, brutal persecution. The writer is encouraging them to have internal confidence in God's unseen promises, even when their visible world is literally falling apart.
So it's about holding on.
Right. Theologians argue that turning a pastoral plea for relational trust into a mechanical tool strips the verse of its historical gravity.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me.
Yeah.
Because viewing faith as a tangible tool leads right into another major concept. Positive confession.
Oh yeah, this is a big one.
This is the idea that your spoken words have literal creative power. And the source notes that proponents frequently use Proverbs 18.21, which says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue." Now, I've heard this applied quite literally. Like if I say, "I'm dying of boredom," someone might actually warn me that I'm literally cursing my physical body.
Which is exactly where scholars of ancient Near Eastern literature weigh in, because you have to categorize what kind of literature you're reading.
Right. Proverbs is a specific genre.
Yes, Proverbs is wisdom literature. It is not a legal code, and it is definitely not a physics textbook. Wisdom literature universally relies on poetic hyperbole.
Meaning it's designed to emphasize social and relational consequences through exaggeration.
Exactly.
Like how warning someone that gossiping will kill a friendship doesn't mean their words are, shooting magic darts.
The author of Proverbs is offering practical wisdom. A kind word heals a rift. A cruel word destroys a reputation.
Right.
It's a moral observation about human behavior, not an assertion that human vocal cords can manipulate atomic structure.
But wait, if we move to the New Testament, they also lean heavily on Mark 11.23. That verse explicitly says, "He shall have whatsoever he saith."
Yes, they do.
That feels pretty cut and dry. If I'm a reader without a theology degree, that sounds exactly like a promise that my words dictate my reality.
It absolutely sounds like that if you stop reading at verse 23. But theologians point to the immediate context, which is just one sentence prior in verse 22.
Okay, what does verse 22 say?
Jesus starts this entire thought by commanding his followers, have faith in God. The scholarly critique is that this passage is defining prayer as an expression of absolute dependence on God's authority. It is not introducing a new mechanism where the speaker's own utterance holds the authority.
Okay, so if the mainstream critique is that human words don't inherently command physical reality, we run into a massive collision when we look at the topics of health and wealth.
A huge collision, yeah.
The source document breaks down how Word of Faith theology teaches that physical healing and financial wealth are guaranteed right now. And they use some dense theological terms here, specifically saying these things were fully secured in the substitutionary atonement. Let's define that real quick. We're talking about the belief that when Jesus died on the cross, he didn't just pay the penalty for sins, but he literally purchased exemption from physical illness and poverty for believers today, right?
That is the word of faith position. And to support the financial aspect of that claim, they often point to 2 Corinthians 8.9, where the Apostle Paul writes that Christ became poor so that you, through his poverty, might become rich.
I mean, I can totally see how someone reads, "He became poor so you might be rich," and thinks, "Fantastic, my financial breakthrough is guaranteed."
Sure, isolated, it sounds like that.
How do exegetes argue against that?
By zooming out to see the rest of the chapter. When historians look at 2 Corinthians 8, they see that Paul isn't writing a theological treatise on personal prosperity at all.
What is he writing?
He's writing a very practical fundraising letter.
Wait, really? Like a first-century charity drive?
Essentially, yes. There was a severe famine affecting the church in Jerusalem at the time.
Oh.
Paul is writing to the Corinthian believers who lived in a wealthy, bustling trade city, and he's asking them to donate money to help the starving Christians in Jerusalem.
Okay.
So Paul uses Christ's spiritual condescension, leaving the glory of heaven to come to earth, as a sweeping theological metaphor.
So he's basically saying, look at how much Christ gave up for you spiritually. Therefore, you should be generous with your material excess.
Exact.
An appeal for charity, not a promise of personal wealth.
Right. To extract that one sentence and turn it into a promise for personal financial gain actually reverses the entire point of the chapter.
Which was about giving your own money away to those who are suffering.
Exactly.
That drastically changes how you read the text.
Yeah.
But what about the health aspect? Because they use Isaiah 53.5, which says, "By his stripes we are healed."
Historic Christian theology certainly affirms that Christ's work addresses all human brokenness, and that includes the ultimate promise of physical resurrection. But critics argue that interpreting Isaiah 53 as a universal guarantee of perfect health in this present life ignores the surrounding words.
What do the surrounding words say?
Well, the very same verse says, "He was wounded for our transgressions." The prophet is clearly discussing spiritual rebellion and forgiveness.
And I imagine scholars also point out that the early Christians experienced profound physical suffering, which kind of breaks the idea that believers are promised perfect health right now.
They absolutely do point that out, yes.
But let's look at the bigger picture. We have all these terms, systematic theology, atonement, ontology. If we synthesize all this, what is a systematic theologian looking at here?
That's a good question.
Because if a believer thinks they can demand health and wealth by triggering these unbreakable laws of faith, how does that alter the entire Christian system of belief?
Well, systematic theology is simply the study of how all the different pieces of a religion fit together into a cohesive whole. It's like if you change one gear, how does it affect the rest of the machine? And theologians argue that this proof texting loop inadvertently but drastically shifts the gear of sovereignty.
Meaning what?
It moves ultimate control from God to the believer.
Oh, wow. So it sounds like God goes from being the ultimate, mysterious, sovereign creator to just being like the software that runs our code.
That's a really sharp way to put it.
We type in the right positive confession, and God is forced to execute the command.
You've hit on the exact concern of the critics. God is transformed into an executor of spiritual laws. If you speak the right words, God is obligated to comply.
That's a huge departure.
Mainstream scholars argue it is a radical departure from Orthodox historical theology, which has always rested entirely on God's unmanipulated sovereign will.
That is a staggering shift in how you view the universe. But to really see how one single passage can be read in two completely opposite ways, our source document points us to the ultimate test case.
Yes. Mark 11.23 and 24.
Right. This is the famous passage about speaking to the mountain and it being cast into the sea.
To understand what's really happening here, we have to look closely at the dramatic actions surrounding Jesus in that moment. Exegetes point out that the author, Mark, uses a brilliant literary device here.
Looks the device.
It's called intercalation. But more informally, scholars call it the Markan sandwich.
The Markan sandwich. I love this. Explain how this literary device works.
Mark has a very specific way of structuring a narrative to make a theological point. He starts a story, interrupts it with a completely different event, and then finishes the first story.
Okay, why?
The structure is meant to force the reader to use the two stories to interpret each other.
Okay, so we have the top piece of bread, the meat in the middle, and the bottom piece of bread. Walk us through this sandwich in Mark 11.
The top piece of bread. Jesus approaches a fruitless fig tree and curses it.
Dead.
The meat in the middle. Jesus immediately goes into Jerusalem, enters the temple, and aggressively drives out the money changers, judging the religious corruption.
Got it.
And then the bottom piece of bread. The next morning, the disciples walk past that same fig tree and see it withered from the roots.
Wait, so Jesus isn't just angrily destroying a random piece of fruit because he missed breakfast. The fig tree is the temple.
Exactly. The tree represents the corrupt, fruitless religious system of the temple in Jerusalem.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
It looked healthy from the outside, with leaves, but it produced no actual spiritual fruit. So when Peter notices the withered tree and points it out, Jesus' response isn't a non sequitur.
Right, he isn't suddenly handing them a manual on how to speed sports cars into existence.
No, his immediate response is what we mentioned earlier: have faith in God.
He's warning them.
Yes, he's saying, the old religious system is falling apart, the temple is facing judgment, your world is about to be turned upside down. You need to rely entirely on God.
It is an exposition of what it looks like to trust God in the face of massive spiritual transition and judgment. It's not a formula for altering your daily personal reality.
Precisely.
Understanding that narrative structure completely changes the scene. But the source material goes even deeper into the mechanics of the text.
Higher.
What happens when scholars zoom in on the exact, precise Greek words Jesus used in that moment?
Because the linguistic deep dive here really dismantles the proof texting approach.
It really does. Break it down for us.
Scholars point to 3 specific linguistic pillars in this passage.
Okay.
First, the phrase, this mountain. In the Greek text, it's tu ore tutu.
Okay.
Jesus does not say a mountain or any mountain. He points and specifies this mountain.
And geographically, where was he standing?
He was on the Mount of Olives, looking directly across the valley at Mount Moriah, which is the Temple Mount.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, in Jewish apocalyptic literature, like the Book of Zechariah, a mountain was a very common metaphor for a corrupt, insurmountable worldly power.
So by specifying this mountain, historians argue Jesus was predicting the literal desolation of the corrupt temple system.
Right. He was not promising believers they could rearrange literal topography.
Wow. Okay, what is the second linguistic pillar?
The phrase does not doubt. The Greek root is diakrino. It doesn't mean a lack of psychological certainty.
Really?
Yeah, it isn't about having a fleeting moment of anxiety. It literally translates to be at variance with oneself or to have divided allegiance.
Oh, that makes so much sense. So the doubt isn't about me having like a momentary flicker of human fear.
Yeah.
It's about keeping a backup plan. It's trying to trust my own power or rely on the old temple system while nominally calling on God.
Exactly. True faith, according to this Greek context, is single-minded reliance on the character of God. It's not working up a perfectly doubt-free emotional state where you force yourself to believe something hard enough.
Right.
And that leads to the third and perhaps most crucial linguistic pillar, the phrase, it will be granted him.
Why is that specific phrasing so important to scholars?
Because the original language uses what linguists call a divine passive.
A divine passive.
Yeah. In ancient Jewish writing, there was an immense reverence for the name of God. To avoid speaking the divine name directly, writers frequently used the passive voice, while still clearly indicating that God is the one performing the action.
Oh, see.
The text doesn't say your words will create the reality. By using the divine passive, it implicitly says God will perform the action.
So God isn't a cosmic vending machine where I punch in the right vocal codes and out pops my miracle?
Definitely not.
The divine passive means the action, the power, and the ultimate result rest entirely on God's sovereign power, not on the raw spiritual force of my vocal cords.
The efficacy of the prayer rests on the identity of the one being petitioned, not the authority of the speaker.
Okay, we've looked at the Greek, we've unpacked the Markan sandwich,
Right.
but I'm curious about the historical consensus.
Let's talk about it.
How did the early church fathers or the reformers read these texts? Because they were reading these passages hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 years before the modern word of faith movement even existed.
Looking at historical theology is incredibly illuminating because it shows us how the earliest readers understood these mechanics. When you look at the patristic era, the early church fathers, they consistently subordinated that phrase, whatever you ask, to the overarching wisdom of God.
How did they explain that logically?
Well, John Chrysostom in the 4th century argued from a perspective of God's mercy. He reasoned that human beings often ask for things that would ultimately harm them.
Which is very true.
Right. Therefore, God mercifully denies those prayers. For Chrysostom, all things was logically restricted to things that actually advance God's kingdom and the believer's spiritual good.
And didn't Augustine approach this by comparing Christian prayer to ancient paganism?
He did, and it's a profound philosophical distinction. In ancient paganism, the goal of a magical incantation was to force the gods to do the human's bidding.
Okay.
Augustine asserted that Christian faith is the exact opposite. He tied his reading directly to the Lord's Prayer, "Thy will be done." For Augustine, faith isn't a mechanism to bend God's will to human desire. Rather, faith is the means by which the human will is transformed and conformed to God's will.
That is a complete 180-degree turn from the idea of using words to demand reality bend to your preferences.
Yeah.
Did the reformers much later see it the same way?
They maintained that exact line of thought. John Calvin dealt extensively with Mark 11 during a time when he was pushing back against various abuses in the church.
What did he say about it?
He specifically warned against turning this passage into a blank check for human imagination. He argued that human hope must be strictly bounded by the actual explicitly stated promises of God in Scripture, not whatever we dream up.
And Martin Luther.
Luther viewed the faith required in this passage not as a metaphysical force, but purely as a relational trust. It's knowing that God acts as a loving father.
Right.
And any parent knows that sometimes the most loving answer you can give a child is no.
It's a stark contrast when you put them side by side. The historic reading focuses entirely on the personal character of God and aligning oneself with his wisdom.
It does.
The Word of Faith reading, at least according to the critics in our source, focuses on the spoken word and unbounded material desires.
Yeah.
It really does all come back to that opening thought. A text without a context is a pretext for a proof text.
Exactly.
When you strip away the Mark and sandwich, when you ignore the divine passive, when you forget that Paul is writing a fundraising letter in Corinthians, you end up with a fundamentally different theology.
And that is the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, regardless of your personal background. We live in an era of unprecedented information overload.
We really do.
We are bombarded with isolated quotes, 10-second clips, and out-of-context screenshots every single day, trying to convince us of one thing or another.
Right.
The most powerful intellectual tool you have is the willingness to pause and seek the broader context. Understanding how to read something, investigating the mechanisms behind the claim, is just as important as knowing what is being said.
It changes how you view the world. Today, we focused heavily on the textual, historical, and theological critique of positive confession. But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Okay.
One that steps away from the ancient texts and looks at the modern human being. Think about the psychological impact of this down the line.
That's a good point.
If a belief system tells you that your literal words unconditionally dictate your physical reality, what happens to your mental health when unavoidable tragedy strikes?
Right.
When someone you love gets sick, or a business fails, despite your best efforts, and you're left agonizing over whether it only happened because you didn't have enough positive confession.
It raises a very profound question about the emotional and psychological burden we place on ourselves when we step outside the boundaries of context.
It really does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of meaning, the danger of proof texting, and the fascinating world of ancient texts. We will catch you on the next one.